I am Tamar Ishalom, and this is Jewish Crossroads. Every horrifying moment in history leaves behind images etched in memory. For me, October 7th brings to mind two specific scenes, one from Israel and the other, surprisingly, from the US. The first is a video clip of Hamas terrorists storming the city streets of Sderot in pickup trucks. I remember being stunned. It was the first visual I saw from the south, this awful enemy not just attacking, but conquering an Israeli city. The second image is from a protest in New York State just days after October 7th, where a Cornell University lecturer spoke with excitement and joy about witnessing those atrocities in Israel. I've watched that clip over a dozen times since, trying to understand how an educated, so-called humanistic, progressive person could express pure joy over the slaughter and kidnapping of civilians. I think I only fully understood it after reading Adam Kirsch's recent excellent short book on settler-colonialism. Adam Kirsch, a poet, Columbia University lecturer, and an editor in the Wall Street Journal's Weekend Review section, felt compelled after October 7th to address something very different from the literature he usually teaches and critiques. The result is a timely, thought-provoking, and deeply troubling book titled On Settler-Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice. I'm truly honored to have him with me today. Shalom, Adam.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking.
What first drew you to the idea of settler colonialism as something worth pushing back against after October 7th? Was there a moment that triggered it?
Well, I think that like you and like a lot of American Jews, definitely, I was very surprised by the way that the October 7th attacks were celebrated by certain groups. Since then, I think a lot of the debate, and certainly today, over Israel has to do with the war in Gaza. But if you can remember back on October 7th, October 8th, before the war in Gaza, the attacks by Hamas that killed 1,200 people, certain elements of the left, especially on university campuses, but also some groups like Democratic Socialists of America or Black Lives Matter groups, immediately welcomed those attacks, saying that they were acts of resistance to settler colonialism. And when I looked at the kind of language that was being used by these people, I realized that the term settler colonialism was sort of everywhere. It was a sort of all-purpose explanation. Why would you celebrate this terrorist attack? Because it's an attack on a settler colonialist country, and therefore it's sort of just because it's against settler colonialism, it's an act of justice. So it seemed like a moment when this idea of settler colonialism, which I was somewhat familiar with from reading about it in academic texts, was coming out of the university and starting to shape real-world political debate. And I think that's continued to be the case since then. So I thought it was a good moment to sort of just write a short book introducing the idea, saying, like, where does it come from? Who are the people behind it? What are some of its implications? And the book, although, as you say, it's a short book, is probably about half about the United States or North America and half about Israel, because the idea really applies to both countries.
Okay, so let's start unfolding your arguments in the book step by step. First of all, what is settler colonialism? And when did this framework start to gain power in Western discourse?
Well, the idea of a settler colonial society or a settler colony, I think, dates back to the 1950s and 60s, the era of decolonization, when the British and French empires were sort of losing control over large parts of Africa and Asia. And different parts of those empires were governed in different ways. In some, there was almost no French or British people living in the colony, like in India. Everyone from Britain who was there was an administrator or soldier or working for the government in some way. And so to leave India, Britain simply had to withdraw those officials. The same was true in the mandatory Palestine as well. But there were other countries like Algeria, notably in North Africa, or Rhodesia in Southern Africa, where there were settlers. Settlers meaning people who had come from Europe to live in these places in large enough numbers that they couldn't simply be, that they became a political factor, let's say. So in Algeria, maybe 15% of the population was European. In Rhodesia, about 8 to 10% of the population was European. When a settler colony is a place where, say, 10% of the population are settlers from somewhere else, and they've been there for a couple of generations, then in those places, the goal of decolonization is to evict those settlers, to take back power and land from them. And that is exactly what happened in Algeria, for example, at the end of a very bloody civil war. When Algeria became independent, there were about 1 million French European people living there, and they almost all left immediately and went back to France. That's sort of the original use of the idea of settler colonialism. In the book, I talk about how in the 1990s, academic theorists, starting in Australia and then in the United States and Canada, started discussing those countries as settler colonies, talking about them as examples of settler colonialism. And those are obviously very different historical situations, because in a country like Australia or the United States, 98% of the population originated somewhere else. Only about 2% of the population has indigenous roots, Aboriginals in Australia or Native Americans in the US. So when you talk about those countries as settler colonial societies and you talk about what it would mean to decolonize them, it's a very different prospect than decolonizing a place like Algeria, right? There's no practical prospect of getting everyone who doesn't belong in these places because they didn't originate there to leave. So in that academic discourse, which I think has become very influential over the last 20 years, there's a lot of discussion of, well, what does it mean to decolonize this society? And the answers are often political, but they're also often spiritual, moral, philosophical. They're about how can we be different kinds of people? How can we erase the sort of stain of colonialism, of colonization that we all have inherited as Americans?
And you point out that it's very vague, the answers about what it means to decolonize Australia or the US.
The answers are almost always symbolic. They are almost always about some sort of verbal formula or way of thinking. They're not ever really about, for example, vacating land, right? That's not on the agenda anywhere. And even people who talk about settler colonialism as a problem seldom would say that the solution is that the United States should give up part of the land and give it back to Native Americans. What tends to happen instead is symbolic gestures like land acknowledgements. I don't know if land acknowledgements have that idea is known around the world, but certainly in North America and Canada, maybe even more than the US, they've become sort of universal in the last 10 years, maybe even less. And a land acknowledgement is a symbolic statement, a formula that an institution, especially a university or an arts or nonprofit institution, will use. They'll either post it on a sign or put it on their website or recite it at the beginning of a public event, which acknowledges the native people that was there before Europeans arrived. And so they'll usually say something like, this university sits on the historic homeland of a certain group, or we acknowledge that they are the custodians of this land. All of these have become ways of sort of acknowledging something that, in fact, everyone already knew, which is that before Europeans lived in America, before it was colonized by English settlers, Native Americans lived across the whole continent. So statements like that don't actually tell us anything that we don't already know. What they tell us is something about what's important. They're a way of saying we should acknowledge sort of formally and in public that our civilization, our country is illegitimate. In a certain sense, it sits on someone else's land. We are the usurpers. And although we might not be able to actually vacate, because of course none of the places that have these statements actually intend to pick up and leave or give back the land, it's important for us to acknowledge in public that we are illegitimate.
And to acknowledge that we are forever guilty. So that is the symbolic realm. But then
Yes.
At some point, Israel is included in the framework, and we go from symbolism to action.
Right. And I think that one reason why the language of settler colonialism has been applied to Israel so much, especially since October 7th, is that a lot of people who see settler colonialism as sort of the original sin in the world, the thing that is responsible for most of the evils in the world, and they see themselves as opposing it, can't oppose it in any practical way in their own countries. But if they see the struggle in Israel as a fight against settler colonialism, then it becomes a sort of symbol or a laboratory or a symbolic battleground where someone they think is taking up arms against settler colonialism. Here's a society where Hamas is actually trying to kill and evict the people who live there. And so I think that explains why a lot of people who consider themselves progressives and would say that they're enlightened and educated people would say there are certain people who it is okay to fight against and kill, and those are the settlers, because they're people who don't belong where they are. And anyone who's doing anything to get rid of the settlers is doing the right thing. So you had this extraordinary, and still to some extent do, extraordinary juxtaposition where you have left-wing groups in the United States saying we support Hamas, we support Hezbollah, we're side by side with Hamas, which of course are Islamic fundamentalist movements that have absolutely nothing in common with what these progressives in America believe. But what they have in common is they say these people are fighting settler colonialism.
So an American or a Canadian progressive can sit in his home and say, well, no one needs to really decolonize myself because it's only symbolic. But in the name of settler colonialism framework, I can call for the decolonization, killing, or evicting of an Israeli because he's a recent settler.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of it has to do with power politics, because there are other examples of settler colonialism around the world that don't get protested very much or even mentioned very much, having to do with China, for example. And I think that the reason is that no one thinks that they can make China do anything. China is too big and powerful. But Israel is small and has this close relationship with the United States. And so American progressives think this is a battle that can be won. It's conceivable that Israel could be destroyed. And that's something that they could imagine happening and therefore see as a sort of real struggle rather than just a theoretical struggle.
Since we're talking about an idea that dominates academia, we're dealing with people who are highly educated, who are supposed to have intellectual integrity. When you look at their response to the argument that Israel is fundamentally different from other cases, from all other cases, because of the deep historical, geographical, and cultural connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, how do they engage with this? I rarely see them seriously addressing it.
Well, I think that there's two parts to the argument or to the idea, and I think that it's complicated to keep both of them in mind. One is that historically, Zionism is completely different from a European colonial movement, right? It was not about a European power seizing land in order to exploit it and to take over resources and make money. It was about small groups of Jews, usually at the beginning, very small individual groups, moving to the land of Israel, which is the historic Jewish homeland. And if anything, the sort of premise of Zionism is that Jews are the indigenous people of the land of Israel, right? They're not settlers and colonists. They're actually the indigenous people who are going back to their home. And so I say in the book, if you could imagine what would decolonization look like in North America if the United States were to take some part of the Southwest, like take a state, Nevada, and say Nevada is now going to be a homeland for all Native Americans and they can move there, create their own culture and society and language. That would look a lot like Zionism. It would look a lot like the creation of the state of Israel. It would be people moving there from all over the world to create this new society. At the same time, I think what Palestinian historians say, and what I think a lot of protesters responding to, is that conditions for Palestinians, particularly in the West Bank, are more like in a settler colony, in the sense that they're governed by people that they have no power over or control over. They're not being governed in their own interests in a certain way. They're being governed for the interests of Israel and under military occupation. So whenever I talk about this, and I talk about the idea of settler colonialism, people will say, well, isn't it true that the West Bank is sort of a colony? And it is sort of true. And it's also sort of true that historically Palestinian Arabs did not want Jews coming to the land of Israel and did not want the state of Israel to be created. So Israel was created against the will of the people who were living there. And that is something that it has in common with other colonial situations around the world. If you had asked Palestinian Arabs at any point up to 1948 or up to 2025, should there be a Jewish state, they would say no. So the fact that Israel was created sort of against the will of the people living there is another thing that a lot of people will say, well, doesn't that make it a colonial society? So it's a very complicated issue, and it's one that's hard to talk about in ways that makes everybody happy or sometimes even anybody happy.
Settler colonialism discourse creates a kind of so-called moral clarity that is very tempting and at the same time is dangerous. Why is that clarity so appealing, especially today?
Well, I think that it allows people who usually don't know very much about the history of the region, the history of Israel, or what the origin of today's conflict is, to know immediately in a very simple terms who's right and who's wrong and whose side they should be on, right? There are good guys and bad guys. The bad guys are the colonizers. That's true wherever you are. So in America, the British colonizers were bad, and In Algeria, the French colonizers were bad. And so in this situation, if Jews are the colonizers, therefore they're the bad guys, and we should be against them. And there's been a real effort, I think a conscious effort in the last 20 years or so, to change the way that pro-Palestinian advocates talk about the conflict, to make it be a conflict between an indigenous people and a colonial sort of foreign alien people. Because I think that framing makes a lot of intuitive sense and appeals to a lot of young people in particular. It creates a sort of superficial and misleading similarity with the history of the United States, which they're more familiar with. And it's interesting. One of the things I sort of learned in doing the research for this book is that traditionally the Palestinian cause did not like that comparison. And the PLO and Yasser Arafat would get angry if people made that comparison between them and Native Americans, for example, because they said, well, look what happened to the Indians. They lost. We don't want to be compared with them. A younger generation of activists has reversed that. They really do say, both Palestinian and American activists say, we're Native peoples. We're struggling against settler colonial occupiers. Therefore, we're basically fighting the same fight. And that, again, leads to some very strange juxtapositions where, say, a Native American tribe protesting an oil pipeline in North Dakota gets approached by Palestinian activists from Gaza saying, from Gaza to Standing Rock, which was the Indian reservation, we're all fighting the same fight against settler colonialism.
Reading the book, I thought about quite an interesting paradox. Although anyone who embraces the settler colonialism framework would insist that they stand in complete opposition, 180 degrees, to the kind of populist politics associated with the current administration, the framework itself shares many characteristics, I think, with populist politics. It simplifies complex realities. It displays anti-institutional tendencies. And while populism operates with a binary of people versus elite, the settler colonial discourse mirrors this with its own binary of oppressor versus oppressed, or colonizer versus native. How does that resonate with you?
I think that's true, and I think that in an odd way, it's one of these examples where if you go far enough to the left, you end up on the right, sort of the extremes meet. Because the basic idea of a lot of settler colonial discourse is that every people in the world has one place where they're supposed to be. It's the place where they started out. And any people that is not in the place where it started out shouldn't be there and should be driven out. And so in North America, that means, the Native Americans are the ones who belong here and Europeans don't belong here. Interestingly, for some theorists, it means that applies not just to white Americans or people whose ancestors came over with the Puritans in the 17th century. Anyone who is not indigenous is a settler, because that's the sort of, in the binary, you're not indigenous, therefore you must be a settler. So that includes recent immigrants. For a lot of people, it even includes the descendants of slaves. If your parents came or ancestors came to North America in slavery, today you are still nonetheless a settler because you're not an indigenous person. And that idea has a lot in common with sort of blood and soil nationalism, 19th century European nationalism, the idea that the only people who can really belong someplace or really understand the land are the people who originated there. It leads to some strange conclusions, some of which I talk about in the book, where people end up saying about Israelis very similar things to the way that fascists talked about European Jews. They'd say, well, they're not rooted here, they're not really from here, they're not part of the soil, they can never really understand what it means to be a part of this land. There are Palestinian advocates who say that about Israelis in just the same way that German nationalists used to say it about Jews in Europe.
And the terror attack in D.C. near the Jewish Museum was a real turning point, because until then, the settler colonialism framework, the BDS movement, and the broader anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian movements were largely expressed through protests, encampments, and at their most extreme, maybe acts of vandalism. But this was a stark example of how an ideology can escalate into violence, just as we've seen it happen on the far right. How do you understand this shift from discourse to violence, and was it a surprise for you?
It was not a surprise. I think it's been heading that way from the very beginning. I think that the language that a lot of the anti-Israel protesters and campaigners have used from the very beginning has been very violent and threatening. It's been sort of both on the theoretical level, because the sort of theoretical goal is to eliminate the state of Israel, which means either killing or making refugees out of millions of Jews. So that in itself is a violent and hostile goal. But also the language and the way that individual Jews sort of in America are addressed by protesters as Zionists has been dehumanizing from the beginning. The idea is that if you are a Zionist, you are basically equivalent to a Nazi. You're someone who's forfeited any sort of moral consideration or human consideration. And so there have been sort of violent gestures and language associated with this from the very start, painting triangles on things, which was taken to be like Hamas paints triangles on targets, and therefore protesters would paint triangles on university buildings saying, we're going to destroy it. Doxing individuals, sort of naming individual Jews to boycott in many cases, saying don't go to a Zionist therapist, don't read a Zionist author. These are all real examples of things that have happened in the U.S. online. All of these things are ways of saying anyone who's a Zionist doesn't deserve to be treated in the way that you would treat a human being. And so eventually that message will get to someone who is crazy enough or violent enough to put it into action and kill someone. And I think that that's what happened in Washington, D.C., and maybe again in Boulder a few days later.
In your book, you vividly describe how a flawed framework dominates many areas of American academia. So how do you view the recent harsh measures taken by the Trump administration against American universities?
Well, to answer to start the answer, how have American Jews thought about it? I think it's been very divisive among American Jews, and I would say that probably the majority are very opposed to the things that Trump is doing in universities. And I think one thing that concerns me is making Jews and anti-Semitism the face of a lot of measures that are very unpopular at these institutions, and really have a lot of negative effects that don't have anything to do with Jews or the way that people talk about Jews or Israel. For example, cutting billions of dollars in research for medicine does not have anything to do with what's happening in the Middle Eastern Studies Department. So the way that Jews have been made the face of this, I don't think is good for Jews in those places and maybe generally. At the same time, I think it's also undeniable that in a lot of these elite institutions, there was a very problematic and wrong way of talking about Israel and the Middle East and maybe other things as well, that those institutions were never going to address on their own. There was no incentive for them to take on those ideas within the university until there was a lot of outside pressure. And that's really what started to happen, not just with the Trump administration, but with a lot of pressure from alumni, donors. After October 7th, a lot of people sort of woke up to the kinds of things that were being taught and said on these campuses and realized that they didn't like it. So I think that started a reckoning. What will become of the sort of current administration campaign remains to be seen. I think we don't know yet whether a lot of these measures are going to be implemented or whether courts will end up deciding that they can't be implemented.
Going back to your book, some critics might say this is just an attempt to silence real injustices. How would you respond to someone who sees your book that way?
I've heard from a lot of people who see the book that way. And what they mainly say is, you're talking about this idea of settler colonialism. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of actual human beings are being killed in Gaza. And isn't that more important? And I would say, yes, it is more important, of course, because human lives are the most important thing. But two reasons why I think it's still worth thinking about and confronting this idea. One reason is that it justifies violence against Jews in Israel and around the world. So it's a threat to Jews. And as Jews, I think that makes it very important for us to be aware of it and to argue back against it. And the second is that the settler colonial framework for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only lead to a worse future. People who advocate for it or people who see the conflict that way think that they're on the side of solving the conflict, but actually I think they're on the side of making the conflict insoluble. Because as soon as you frame it as Israeli Jews are colonizers who don't belong here and need to be decolonized, that makes sure that it's an existential conflict that Israel can never make peace in, that it has to be a war to the end. Because if someone wants to destroy your country and is determined to destroy your country, thinks it shouldn't exist, you can't make peace with someone like that. And so I think that by encouraging this view of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as there's no room for discussion, compromise, peacemaking, there's only room for one people in this land, it can only belong to one people, and for the left or for one group, only Palestinians can be here, for some on the right, only Jews should be there. that is a recipe for war, endless war, and really damages everyone. So I think that it's not incompatible to say, yes, I think we should all be concerned about innocent deaths on both sides, but also we should be concerned about this false framing of the conflict that hurts both sides.
You've spent your career asking and exploring what does it mean to be a Jewish writer. You even wrote a book on the subject. So what does it mean today, at this moment, to be a Jewish writer?
Well, I think that Jewish writers, like a lot of other American Jews, have been very shocked by how prevalent anti-Zionism is in intellectual circles, how respectable it is, and how ready a lot of people who we might have thought of as our colleagues and peers are to say, if you support Israel, we won't talk to you, we won't include you in our events, we won't publish alongside you. And certainly a lot of writers, leading American writers, have said we won't publish in Israel, we won't allow our works to be published by an Israeli publisher. So there's a real question being asked of Jewish writers of, do you want to be in the sort of Zionist camp or in the other camp, which is much more numerous and contains a lot of the, the prestige, the awards, the resources. If all of those things are on the side of saying, I will not be a Zionist, it really makes people make choices. That has not been a problem for me because, as you say, I'm a very Jewishly oriented writer, and a lot of what I write about is about and for Jewish audiences. But I think it is a problem for a lot of people, especially younger writers, trying to make their careers. It forces them to make difficult choices. So it has been a shock, I think. I think a lot of people have had to think about where their priorities are, where their loyalties are. And what complicates it is that I think a lot of even Zionist Jews in America are, I won't be surprised to you if I say this, are very troubled by a lot of things happening in Israel. There's a real division between Israeli Jews and American Jews on a lot of issues because we're affected by them very differently, right? It's one thing if a war is happening to people who you identify with 8,000 miles away. It's another thing if the war is happening to you and members of your family are fighting in it. And so there is a real difference in the way that we as American Jews and Israeli Jews feel, I think, and respond instinctively. And that's been another division in the Jewish community after October 7th that has caused a lot of anguish. So it's definitely a time when I think Jewish writers have an important role to play, to think about these things, to talk about these things, to try to encompass as much of the difficulty and the complexity of the situation as possible, while ultimately maintaining that we are one people and that we have common interests around the world.
Do you believe books can change minds? Do you believe this book can change minds?
My experience with this book has been mainly that it has been welcomed by people who agree with it and ignored or not welcomed by people who don't agree with it. And
that's a problem, isn't it?
That is the problem, and obviously not just for this book, but in lots of ways in politics and other things, and maybe it's always been that way to a certain extent. It's hard to convince someone who's very committed to an idea that their idea is wrong. In fact, trying to do that often just makes them more committed to it. But one reason why I thought it was important to write about this book from this point of view is that people who talk about settler colonialism within the academy are only ever talking about it as a sort of self-evidently true and right proposition. And it's also a form of activist scholarship. It's not about sort of historical study in a detached scholarly way. It's about power struggles. It's about changing reality. And so I thought it was useful maybe just to have one book on the subject that says these are not necessarily the right ideas. These are flawed ideas, sort of at the very foundations they're flawed, and that we should not just sort of assume that all these things are true, but actually take issue with them and argue with them.
And I guess there are a lot of people in the middle. Not everyone's convinced one way or another. There are a lot of people who don't know much and don't have a lot of not the knowledge and are not convinced to either side.
Definitely. I think that probably even among people who are convinced, there's not a lot of knowledge. I think a lot of people who are take very strong positions on this subject don't necessarily know a lot about the history or about the actual demographics or what's actually happening day to day on the ground. So it's always good to try to get people to think and know more about these things. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to end up agreeing with you, but maybe it's better for all of us to have the sort of same facts in common.
Well, a warm recommendation for the book from both myself and the Jewish Crossroads podcast. It's truly essential reading, a must read to understand the political moment we're living in. And Adam, we've reached the final part of our conversation, the Jewish Crossroads Questionnaire. 5 quick and fun questions. Are you ready?
Yes.
What's your earliest Jewish memory?
Earliest Jewish memory would probably be being Mordechai in the Purim Carnival, in the Purim Spiel when I was probably 3 years old.
If you could meet any Jewish figure from history, ancient or modern, who would it be and why?
That's a good question. If I could pick a biblical figure, I'd say Moses, of course, because I'd like to know. I'd like to know what he knew and what he saw.
What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
Probably the Passover Seder is one that's been the most meaningful to me. It's one that takes on new meanings year by year. I think I feel and understand it in different ways as I know more about Judaism as a tradition and as the world changes.
If you could jump 100 years into the future, what would you hope to see for the Jewish people?
I would hope to see, there are a lot of things to hope for, aren't there? I would hope to see peace between Israelis and Palestinians, peace between Jews and Arabs, and Israel in a secure and defined border.
What's one Jewish word? It could be Hebrew, English, Yiddish, whatever, that feels particularly meaningful to you right now.
That's a good question.
It's a problem because I'm asking a poet. You have so many words
Yeah, that's
in
right.
your
There's
mind.
so many words that you could say. I think that the idea of Am Yisrael, the idea of the peoplehood of Israel, is something that is important to sustain. I feel like it's very important to sustain right now. The idea that Jews in different places, living in different ways, inside a Jewish state and outside a Jewish state, are all part of the same people. And I think that's something that's easy for all of us to lose track of, and it's important to remember.
It's been such a pleasure having you on our podcast. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
That's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. Thank you to Tomer Atzabi Bar, who edited this chapter. We'll see you next time, same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon.